Hey, Mountain Springs Church, I have the privilege this weekend of introducing to you our guest speaker. Some weeks ago, we began the series going through 1st and 2nd Samuel, and this weekend, we are nearing the end of the series. Ben, our guest speaker this weekend, is the leader of Uncharted International. It's a missions agency that works to establish the works of God overseas in currently unreached remote parts of the world. It's a fantastic organization, and Ben, a former Mountain Springs member, is now leading this organization based in Indiana. This weekend, Ben is going to come and share a word with us as we draw our series to a close. So would you join me in giving a very warm Mountain Springs Church welcome to one of our former very own, Ben Stewart.
All right, wow. Thank you for that. It is great to be back with you guys. I know that you probably don't know me personally, and I don't know many of you personally, but this church does have a really sweet place in the heart for me and my family. When we lived out here in Colorado Springs for several years, we were part of this church for a significant part of that season, and there was some sweet community that we had at this church, and some just great time of healing and worship, and it's always a joy to be back here with you guys. And as Daniel said, he did a great job describing Uncharted. That's the organization that God moved us to help lead in Indiana. And Uncharted is a missions organization that focuses not just on unreached people groups, but places and people that are typically overlooked. And we would love to interact with you more if you want. We have a booth out in the lobby if you'd love to just learn more about what type of mission that looks like and what we do specifically. I'm here with one of my good friends and a coworker, and we love to hang out with you guys. But it's great to be here, to be continuing to talk about 1st and 2nd Samuel. Now, I do have to call Daniel out on this. I'm noticing a pattern. You know, one of the reasons why I've stayed connected to Mountain Springs is through my friendship with Daniel. But there's this pattern forming that each time he asks me to come out to speak, he grabs his wife and he flees the state. So I'm not sure what that says about our friendship, but I'm glad that he can be where he is and happy to be with you guys continuing in 1st and 2nd Samuel. And that's what we're doing. Man, I have to say, so I've been following along with you guys via podcast and online and all that sort of stuff, listening to this series. It's been really fun to hear what God has been bringing up in themes and lessons for this church body. 2 weeks ago, hearing the vision, the recast of where you guys are headed, it's really exciting. And I think it's a really big deal. I think it's a really big deal that you guys as a church have committed to walking through not just a couple books in the Old Testament, but specifically 1st and 2nd Samuel. Like, those are not easy. There's some really funky, crazy sections of scripture in 1st and 2nd Samuel. It's a great thing that you guys have been walking through this. So I know it's a little bit awkward, but give yourselves a round of applause because it's really cool that you've been walking through 1st and 2nd Samuel. You're almost done. You've hung in there. We're about to land the plane. And that's what's going to happen is we are coming to a close. And so I'm going to look at one major last scene towards the end of 2 Samuel, and then Daniel next week is going to sort of put a bow on it. And so the scene that we're looking at today encompasses several chapters. And it's the scene where one of David's sons, Absalom, causes a rebellion, an insurrection, and he ends up overthrowing David for a period of time. And first of all, I should say it's a really big section, and so what we're going to be doing is I'm just going to do a little bit of a flyover and context, and then just dipping down into a few specific encounters in this story. But I'm excited for this section for a couple of reasons. First of all, because I really believe that it's a section that resonates with everybody, regardless of where you find yourself this morning. It's a section I believe resonates with everybody because really it's a story, to steal a line from J.R.R. Tolkien's The Hobbit, it's a there and back again story. It's a story of two different paths. David gets kicked out of his city, of his kingdom, of his rulership. He gets kicked out, and the first journey, the first path is this path of loss, of grief, and of pain. But the second path, the there and back again, is a path of victory towards triumph, towards restoration. And as I was thinking about this, that's really sort of the summation of life, right? There's not much in between. Like today, you find yourself either on a path that is more marked by things that feel like loss and grief and pain, or a path that feels more marked by things that feel victorious and triumphant and good and restorative. There's not much in between. And what's great about this story is that it gives us an example in David's journey of, first of all, how to walk through loss with integrity. How to walk through loss with integrity, and then how to move towards victory in an honorable way. And so we're going to be looking at what's interesting in the way that the author of 2 Samuel lays this story out. Chapters 15 through 20 is there are encounters that David has with certain individuals as he leaves Jerusalem, not just leaves, flees. As he runs away from Jerusalem, there's different encounters with different people that reveal his integrity as he walks this path of loss. And then there's different encounters that he has with people on the way back into the city of Jerusalem towards victory and restoration. So my hope is this morning that whatever path, wherever you fall on that continuum, that you will hear God's voice speaking to you in a very real and practical way through this story. But I'm also excited for this because this story, more than anything else, is a demonstration of this beautiful reality that God's restoration has the final word over your sin and brokenness. Hear that. And if you don't hear anything else, hear that. Ultimately, this story is reminding us that God's restoration has the final word over brokenness and sin. Now, to set this story up, there's some context that I need to get us all on the same page because it's chapters 15 through 20, but really what's happening in the story is that David is experiencing the consequences of his sins. The sins of his past are catching up, you could say. First of all, in chapter 11, you heard a great message last week. Pastor Evan took on a very hard story of David's sin with Bathsheba and Uriah. And in that story, in chapter 11, you have the prophet Nathan coming to David and calling David out. And very specifically, Nathan says, "The sword shall never depart from your house, David. The sword shall never depart from your house because you have despised the Lord." The story of Absalom's rebellion in chapters 15 through 20 is the exact specific fulfillment of what Nathan just prophesied to David in chapter 11. And so what we see happening in chapters 15 through 20 is the fulfillment of David's sin of commission. If you've ever heard that phrase, it's like a Christian churchy phrase. The sin of commission is sins that we do, fully aware that they go against the heart and the character of who God is. Full awareness that we are going against the heart and the character of God, and it's catching up to David. But there's not only just the sin of commission that's catching up to him, there's also the sin of omission. Sin of omission are things that we don't do. Things that we ignore, things that we choose not to do, that we know we should do because they do reflect the heart and character of who God is. And in chapter 13, you have another very devastating, dark story where one of David's other sons rapes one of David's other daughters, Tamar. And David, as the king, does not do, not just as a father, but also as a king, does not do what he should have done, and he does not give out justice for this sin. And so when you take the culmination of all of these sins, we get chapters 15 through 20. David's sin is catching up with him, the consequences of it. And as we go further into this, there's just a couple things that I wanted to acknowledge. First of all, sin is real. Sin is real. Now, I know that can sound very sobering, and that's not fun to say, and it's kind of like, hey, welcome to Mountain Springs. Aren't you glad you came today? I'm the guest speaker. Sin is real. But it's true that one of the things that this story reveals to us and really tries to nail home is the reality of sin. And what John says in 1 John chapter 1 is that we deceive ourselves if we say that sin is not in us. So you may not agree with that. You may not know that. You may not like that. But we are all on common ground when it comes to sin. It's real. Second, to acknowledge hand in hand with that there are consequences of sin and that there are effects of sin. And if you find yourself specifically walking in a season or on a path of loss and grief and pain today, it could be that some of you are on that path because of consequences of sin that you have specifically committed. That's true. It could also be, though, that you experience a season of loss and grief and pain because of the effects of sin. I mean, all you have to do is turn on the national news to see the effects of sin, right? All you have to do is see how the shrapnel and the fallout of one person's choice, one person's mistake, one person's sin, and how many people are affected by that. You see that in the story of Absalom's rebellion in chapters 15 through 20, that when David has to flee the city, he doesn't flee alone. That there are whole families and communities affected by this brokenness. We experience not just the consequences of our own sin, but we experience the effects of others as well. But friends, even though that's sort of a sobering reality to start with, that sin is a very real thing, as are its consequences and its effects, even though it's sobering to realize that we are all infected and affected by sin, it makes the good news of why we gather here in the first place, the good news of Jesus Christ, all the more sweeter. That God's restoration has the final word. And so what I want to do just for the last few minutes is highlight some different encounters that David has as he walks on the path of loss, and one particular encounter that he has on his journey towards victory. So you're going to have to use your imaginations. You're going to have to transport yourself back to this scene, okay? You are with David. You're one of those families who's fleeing for your life out of the city of Jerusalem towards a city of refuge. You're on this journey, and here's different encounters that you have. First of all, in chapter 15, verse 24 through 26, and here's how we're going to go through this. If you want to keep up with me, that's great. Otherwise, I'm just going to fly through these different sections. Some of these I'm going to read specifically. Some of them I'm going to summarize. We may not get to all of them. We're just going to see what the Spirit does, okay? So, in verse 24 of chapter 15, David is leaving in grief. He's leaving in sorrow. There's weeping going on. There's tearing of clothes. There's putting of ashes on heads. And he encounters this guy named Zadok in verse 24. Now behold, Zadok also came, and he was one of the Levites. Now the Levite was a priest, and they were in charge of the Ark of the Covenant. And several messages ago in this series, the Ark of the Covenant was talked about. The Ark of the Covenant was and represented God's presence at that time to the nation of Israel. So Zadok comes with the Levites carrying the Ark of the Covenant, and they set down the Ark of God, and Abiathar came up until all the people had finished passing from the city. And the king said to Zadok, "Return the Ark of God to the city." So David says to Zadok, "I know you've brought the Ark out. You're intending that the Ark come with me as I flee the city, but I actually want you to return it to Jerusalem." Now listen to these words, because here's the first point. As David goes down this journey of loss, he does so in a posture of submitting to God's will. He submits to God's will. The way that we walk through loss with integrity is we submit to God's will. Listen to this. "If I find favor in the sight of the Lord, then he will bring me back again and show me both it," meaning the ark, "and his dwelling place. But if he should say to me, 'I have no delight in you,' behold, here I am. Let him do to me as seems good to him." Don't miss the power of what David is demonstrating as he walks with integrity through this season of loss. What he's saying to Zadok in this encounter and what he's demonstrating to all the people who are around him is no matter what happens in this situation, no matter what levels of grief and loss I experience, I am going to submit myself to the will of God through this journey. Friends, this is huge. Because if we're honest with ourselves and we take a moment to think about and reflect on how do we normally respond when we experience loss? So I'll be honest, this became super personal for me just a few days ago. Uncharted is an organization that relies heavily on individual donors and businesses and other partners to finance our work around the world. And because of extenuating circumstances, one of the key businesses that partners with us can no longer support us. So we're in this season of facing loss. And I share this only because what I have come face to face with is the reality of how do I typically respond in a season of loss. I become angry. We can become resentful. We try to manipulate the situation. That's what I try to do. I go into fix-it mode. What can I do to overcompensate? How can I address this? And what David is demonstrating with these words is total submission to whatever God wants to do. In other words, to say it this way, David leaves restoration up to God. David leaves restoration up to God, to his way of restoring and to his timing of restoring. He knows this whole encounter with Zadok in the Ark of the Covenant, he's learned his lesson that you cannot manipulate the presence of God. You cannot manipulate. We cannot control God. And really, when it comes to loss, that's ultimately the thing that we hate losing the most, isn't it? Is control. We hate losing control. But listen to David's words. If I find favor in the sight of the Lord, then he'll bring me back. But if he should say to me, I have no delight in you, behold, here I am, let him do to me as seems good. Friends, you want to walk through a season of loss and grief with integrity. It starts with this posture and this attitude that reflects total submission to the will of God. The second encounter that we see kind of goes hand in hand with this and comes right afterwards. It's with a guy named Hushai. So you have an encounter with Zadok, then you have an encounter with Hushai. There's some great names for babies for those of you who are expecting kids out there. You have this encounter with Hushai in verses 32 through 37, and I'm just going to summarize this one because of the time. But basically, Hushai is this guy who is loyal to David, and he comes up to David and he says, okay, I want to hook up with your band, and I'm going to flee from the city with you. And David says, no, actually, here's what I need you to do. I need you to go back to Absalom. I need you to go back into the courts, and I need you to serve there as a spy, and I need you to thwart the counsel of Absalom. Now, I think why this is important is because you see this in the context of David walking in a very honest and genuine season of grief and loss. He's not trying to put a veneer over anything. So if all of you happy Christians out there who are in seasons of loss don't feel like you have to be chipper and fine all the time and slap smiles on your face, he's real about his grief. He knows that he's walking in submission to God's will. And he acts in such a way that has a deep conviction on the promises of God. Because he hasn't given up on God's promise to him that God will establish his kingdom forever. And he's demonstrating that he hasn't given up by saying to Hushai, look, there's a really good chance that God's going to come through on his promise and I'm going to be restored and I need you to be there and ready when I'm restored. As we walk through seasons of loss and pain, we need to grieve them. We need to be real and honest about them. We need to submit ourselves ultimately to the will of God and not try to control or manipulate the situation. And we need to remember the promises that God has declared and spoken over you. So, friend, what is the promise today that you need to hear again from the Father? Third encounter on this trail or this journey of loss is an encounter with another guy named Shimei. This one also is a long section. It's in chapter 16, verse 5 through 14. This one has a very personal lesson to me. And the story with Shimei is that Shimei was a relative of Saul. And if you remember, Saul was the first king, and he and David had a little bit of a tumultuous relationship, to say the least. And so the family of Saul didn't have a great relationship with the family of David. And so here, this guy named Shimei, who's a relative of Saul, sees David fleeing the city of Jerusalem. And he's like, oh, yeah. So he comes out and he literally starts chucking rocks at David, and he starts kicking dust on him, and he starts calling him all sorts of bad names and just reaming him out and telling him what a loser he is, and he should have never been king in the first place, and all this sort of stuff. Now, David's with all of his guys. He's with all of his homeboys and warriors, and they're all like, oh, no, this is not good. David, let us take us out. We can take him out. We can chop his head off right now. David's like, no. Because maybe, I'm paraphrasing a little bit, because maybe there's something in here that God is wanting me to learn. Maybe there's a lesson that God is trying to teach me through this man. Now, when I started my ministry career, I was this young punk 22-year-old, fresh out of Bible college, thought he knew everything about everything. And I should not have been given in charge of a ministry, but I was put in charge of high school ministry, because what better place to start somebody than investing in the next generation, right? And so I'm a high school pastor at this church, and I get my first one of those phone calls, like those phone calls where this person is just reaming you out. So they're reaming me out. They're telling me what a terrible youth pastor I am, and I should have never been hired for this position. And in my head, I'm kind of like, well, actually, I think you're kind of right, but I'm here. And so they just kind of get into me. And I'm furious. And so I go running into the office of my boss at that time, the pastor who's got much more wisdom than me. And I unload on him. I'm like, this is terrible. This person shouldn't have said that. And that's not true. And they don't know the truth. And they don't know the context. And they don't know that this is a good decision. And I'm just going on and on. He's just sitting there listening. And then he opens his Bible and he takes me to this scene. And he reads it to me. I'm like, dude, that's not what I need right now. He's like, I know. But here's what I want you to see, Ben. That even if 99% of what Shimei said to David, David demonstrated a posture of teachability and humility as he walked through loss. He was humble enough to say, maybe there is something even in this that God is wanting to teach me. So friends, as we walk through seasons of loss, maybe we submit to God's will, allowing the restoration to the Lord. May we cling to the promises of God, and may we adopt and embrace a posture of teachability and humility. Now, in chapters 18 and 19, you have these crazy encounters, this battle that happens between Absalom's army and David's army. There's some craziness that's going on in there, and we don't have time to talk about all of that craziness, but what ends up happening in the end is you see God's hand of restoration moving through that battle, and David wins, ultimately. And now, David is starting his journey towards triumph, his journey towards victory. And there's one key encounter that I want to start to end our time with and focus on, because it connects to Shimei, because it has to deal with Shimei again. And so in chapters 19, you have to now realize the tables have turned. And so everybody who was disloyal to David is now freaking out, because David is being restored as king, and he's coming back into Jerusalem, and that includes Shimei. And so Shimei is like, oh shoot, I was that guy who kicked dust on this guy who's now king again, and I cursed him, and I threw rocks at him. He's going to kill me. He's going to take me out for sure. He's going to unleash his mighty warriors. So Shimei gathers all these gifts and presents, and he comes and he presents himself to David, and he basically begs for his life to David in chapter 19. And in chapter 19, this is what David does. In chapter 19, verse 21 through 23. 22 through 23. David then said, "What have I to do with you, O son of Zeruiah, that you should this day be an adversary to me? Should any man be put to death in Israel today? For do I not know that I am king over Israel today?" And the king said to Shimei, "You shall not die." Why is this significant? Because even as David is on the road towards victory and triumph, he's demonstrating an incredible amount of honor and humility and mercy. In essence, he's saying to Shimei, he's releasing Shimei from the wrong that was done against him. Does that need to happen at all in your life? He's releasing Shimei from the wrong that was committed against him. And in a way, he's restoring Shimei his life and his position. In other words, another way of saying it is David does not give Shimei what he deserves. And that's called mercy. David does give Shimei what he doesn't deserve. And that's called grace. Friends, as we close this section, one of the interesting things as I was reading through different commentaries and just kind of prepping for this is that there was this common overarching theme, this overarching really question that chapters 15 through 20, there's a question that this section is begging to ask, and it's this question: what king is worthy to be king? As you look at the insurrection of Absalom, who says, my dad is not worthy to be king. And he takes over and he kicks out his dad from the throne. And then you have David who's walking through the consequences of his sin. The whole section is asking this question: who is worthy to be king? And the significance of this, friends, is that it foreshadows in a very powerful way that there really is only one true king who is worthy to be king. Because this echoes back to 1 Samuel chapter 8, where Samuel, the prophet, stands before the nation of Israel and he says, are you really sure you want a king? Are you really sure you want a king? And then 6 times he says in a very short amount of verses that all these kings will do to you is take and take and take and take and take and take. And so what this whole passage is demonstrating is who is really worthy to be king. It's not the king who takes, but it's the king who gives. It's the true king. Matthew chapter 20, verse 28, which says, just as the Son of Man, Jesus Christ, the true king, did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. Friends, this is ultimately what this section of 2 Samuel demonstrates to us, is that there's actually only one king who is worthy to be king. It is the king who does not take. It is the king who gives. It is the king who gives his life for not just the many, but for you. So that coming full circle, this is ultimately how. It's through the giving of the true king. This is ultimately how God's restoration has the final say over your loss, over your grief, over your brokenness. At the end of chapter 20 of 2 Samuel, there's this really brief, at first glance, kind of boring section where it lists out all of David's officials, who his scribes are and who his court officials are. But it's super important because it's the exact same type of language and structure that is used back in 2 Samuel chapter 8 when David is first becoming the king. And so it bookends. And it's as if God is saying, the author is saying, look, it's final restoration. Things are back to the way they were meant to be in the first place. Things are back together. Friends, it's because of the true king who doesn't take, but who gives and who gave his life for you, that we can walk a journey, a path of loss and grief and brokenness, and yet have hope that God's restoration has the final word. And so it's only right for us, in response, to stand together and to worship this King and to leave here knowing that we walk in hope because God's restoration has the final word. Let's stand together and worship.